Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to today's webinar focusing on Mexico's renewable energy sector and what we can expect in 2019. We're hoping to provide some insights today into the country's new government, as well as new opportunities and also challenges that are facing the sector. My name is Jamie Dalswell, and I'm the director of MIREC Week, one of Mexico's longest running renewable energy events, and also the organizers of this webinar. Just a very quick bit of info on MIREC Week before we begin. The event will be taking place in Mexico City next month from the 20th until the 22nd of May. And it's an event where we combine some great networking opportunities like dinners, lunches, and cocktails, alongside some expert analysis and also some business intelligence on Mexico's clean energy sector. Look out for more details at the end on how to register for the event. Now, just moving on. In the next hour or so, we certainly don't promise all of the answers in what is a very interesting renewable energy sector in Mexico, but I'm very pleased to confirm the participation of 4 experts who can at least provide some perspectives on what we can expect for the year ahead and beyond. Please also note that via the GoToWebinar app, you can send in your questions. And if we have time at the end, we'll be able to ask some of them to the panel, and hopefully we can answer as many as possible. There's also a couple of handouts available through the GoToWebinar app as well. One is a report on Mexico that was compiled from MIREC Week about 2 months ago, just giving a general summary on what's happening in the sector. So you may want to download it just to review it as you're listening to the webinar. And the second is a report which we'll be releasing today, focusing on Mexico's bilateral market for PPAs as well. So both very interesting reports in case you need some more information there. Just to provide some context to today's webinar, last year, Mexico voted in a brand new administration headed up by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, as he's more commonly known, and his Morena party. They campaigned on a platform of changing the status quo, and after more than 100 days in power now, he's certainly achieved this. His government has shaken up a broad cross-section of different sectors and industries, including banking, infrastructure, and of course, energy. So to discuss the impact of AMLO, as well as the ongoing opportunities and challenges facing Mexico's renewable energy sector, it's my pleasure to introduce today's 4 experts who are going to be sharing their inputs and analysis. We have Santiago Barcon, who is the editor for Energía Hoy. Santiago heads up Energía Hoy, which in my opinion is one of the leading publications in Mexico for energy news. And he's also an expert on all things related to the country's electricity sector, having advised various government bodies and associations over a number of years. I'm also pleased to welcome Marco Nieto Vasquez, who's the Director of Economics and an Energy Partner with Baker & McKenzie Mexico. Marco is a member of Baker McKenzie's Energy, Mining, and Infrastructure Industry Group and advises a host of private and public sector clients, and has been for many years throughout the energy sector. We also welcome Dina Barajas, who's the partner with Akin Gump. Dina is a global project finance lawyer whose practice emphasizes Latin American infrastructure project financings, debt financings, and mergers and acquisitions. His clients include commercial lenders, institutional investors, investment funds, project sponsors, and public and private companies. And last but certainly not least, pleased to welcome Pablo Otin, who's the CEO of Paratis. Pablo currently develops and finances PV projects in Brazil and Brazil and Spain, and was formerly the head of international development for renewable energy developer 8-Minute Energy. He's been keeping a close eye on Mexico, and I'm sure we'll be able to share some insights from a unique international perspective. So, gentlemen, welcome to today's panel. A pleasure to have you here. I think I'd like to begin today just by talking about, well, it's not really an elephant in the room, but something which everyone has their eyes on in terms of the new government. And just to get a little bit more of a sense of what kind of energy policies we can expect from AMLO's new government, as well as what kind of official framework the administration has been talking about so far. We're yet to receive or have a publication of the National Electricity Framework, which the AMLO government has promised to release in the next couple of months. But before that comes out, I'd like to ask you if you can provide some insights into what some of the messages have been so far in terms of where AMLO's energy policy will go. And I'd like to begin this with Marco, if you could perhaps give your perspectives first.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure, as always, to share with you our perspectives and the panelists, as well as the question that from the participants arise. In my perspective, we need to understand that this is not only a government change. We also need to understand what is the real impact on the perspective, mainly addressed to the anti-corruption policy, which is part of the current administration policies. We need to also that in terms of the energy sector, going beyond the political insights or the openness, we need to back to the basics. What are the basis on the energy reform in the prior administration was promoted and designed? In my perspective, we have two bases. The first one is the open access for not only for the power sector, but also for the entire energy reform. The second one is, of course, the strict legal separation, which is a very important part of the design in the energy reform. The third one is, for me at least, is the asymmetric regulation, which is part of the current issue in terms of the perspective with the new government for CFE. And the last one is, of course, the sustainability principles, mainly addressed to the social impact assessment. If you think what are the perspective on that, you can see on a global standpoint that those focuses are not exactly the only one to address and promote efficiency in the market. In that regards, we need to understand that even we don't have open access or asymmetric regulation, if we try to understand that the efficiency in the sector is one of the most important purposes in this line to promote the renewable sector, of course we can understand that this is not a real impact in terms of the promotion for the generation. Of course, we know that most of the generation requirements will need to be addressed in terms of the investment. Of course, Dino can talk about that, but I think that in that perspective, we don't have the same promotion as the energy reform approach, of course, but it doesn't imply automatically that, in my perspective, we don't get any opportunity in the short, medium, and long term.
Okay, fantastic. And I think that's a great opening, and I would like to pass it to Dino. Now, obviously, from the investment perspective, you'll have a very good grasp of exactly how people from the outside looking in at this new administration and what some of their sentiments are in terms of what their energy policies, or at least some of their pronouncements, have been in the past, say, 3-4 months.
Surely, at least from my view, the one thing that I think is going to happen here in the next year or two is you're going to see one of the most active energy markets in Mexico. So with the pronouncement of the cobbling back together of CFE, you may see some programs that start looking like the programs of the past, where you had RFPs by CFE and CFE essentially being one of the main providers of electricity throughout the country, as opposed to the open market that had been the trend under the past administration, where customers and generators were beginning to form closer relationships, and the market was moving to a more open and diverse sector. One of the things that we're seeing, at least in the M&A side, is the transferring of development rights and projects. So as the country as a whole changes the risk perspective, it's providing for the exiting of more conservative lenders and funds that had as their investment strategy very specific policies that they wanted to see in the country, and the new entrants coming into the market are now given a second opportunity to come in and perhaps face a more robust market, if you will. And this is going to, I think, re-energize the sector as a whole, because you're going to have people coming into the market that want to see what niche opportunities are available to them. Their investors, developers are also going to start coming back into the market, who either want to do bilateral contracts, want to re-enter the CFC RFP market, and I think you're also going to start seeing a new resurgence again in renewable energy, regardless of what the government policies are, because at the end of the day, one of the things that people were seeing in the market as late as last year were extremely competitive renewable energy pricing, and irrespective of what government policies are announced, renewable energy is simply just going to make sense as part of the generation mix for the country as a whole.
Yeah, certainly. And I think after recent statements since the beginning of the year, we've seen a trend towards more mention of obviously more of a hydrocarbons focused policy, but also hydro. Santiago, I know you're having some technical issues before, and I believe you're connected now. From someone who is based in Mexico, who has a really great in-depth knowledge of the sector, what are your perspectives in terms of the AMLO's energy policies?
Well, I've finally solved, Jamie, all the technical issues. I'm a little bit, I'm positive that the administration is learning about the ropes. No, there has been only 100 and some days since we had a change in the administration. And of course, some of the main news went with the cancellation of the four renewable auction. But if we look into the whole picture, I think that this auction, was set up by the last government, and they need to sit down and learn about the ropes of the business. And besides that, there's this transmission constraint issue. And the more renewables that you add into the system, the more stiff and reliable that the transmission system needs to be. As probably everyone is aware, we're having black the southwest of the country, and daily there are load shedding. So that's not very good news, especially when you are trying to grow economically. So my perspective is that eventually they will come back. And I always point out that, when the Peña Nieto administration took over, no one was expecting an energy reform. So I think that we have to have a little bit of time and of course be close to the administration and talk to them and try to give the best information that we can in order to help them to understand the business. And overall, as I mentioned, I am positive on the outcome that we can have as a country, especially in the renewable sector. That will be my comment.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the cancellation of the auctions earlier this year was a bit of a surprise to some. And obviously there's hope that the government will review and bring them back, but we'll come to that a bit later. But I think this is a good time perhaps to ask you, Pablo, from a developer's perspective, some of the statements that have been made by the AMLO government and your perspective on what's been happening in terms of the energy policy of the government in the past 3 months or so, and what you think will happen over the next 6, 9, 12 months.
Sure. So again, thank you for inviting and thanks for the opportunity to speak. So if I can use an analogy, I think the Mexican market has gone from red hot to maybe blue cool, right? So it was receiving a lot of attention and attracting significant amount of development. And right now, I would say there is some sort of pause. With that said, and keeping the analogy, it truly depends on where you are in the supply chain. If you're a developer, arguably, I would say this is one of the best time since there's plenty of opportunities. And I would agree with Dino that the fundamental hasn't changed. Maybe the policy and some of the elements around the administration might not be necessarily something that we will welcome as an industry, but the fundamentals hasn't changed. Energy is growing up. The renewable, particularly solar, is incredibly competitive. We have probably the best product right now with respect to electricity generation as a whole. And if people are incredibly smart, the country is very savvy with respect to energy and electricity and contracts. And if the auctions are not there, developers and off-takers and consumers will figure out a way to basically transact on a product that they desire, in this case solar, but I would say could apply as well to wind. So in my opinion, it really depends on where you are in the supply chains. If you're a developer, I would say, well, the AMLO administration just opened up an opportunity. And if you have in mind that development is an art that takes several years, what would you, if you find a good project and you're patient and you believe in the fundamentals, it's not exactly the worst that it could happen. That's sort of my view. Obviously, if you're an investor and you're looking for sort of a guarantee product and government backing and so on and so forth, that certainly the story has changed. So I would say that depends on where you are.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that this is some really great perspectives to begin with, looking at the overall sector and looking at energy as a whole. And in terms of the different bodies that make up Mexico's energy sector, obviously we have CENER, we've got the CRES, CENACE, Semarnat. I'm not going to try and read them all out. And also, I guess you could call the CFE somewhat of a government body as well, the state utility. Santiago, obviously the last administration had developed a lot of those different organs of government focused on energy within their own mold. What we're already seeing with the AMLO administration are some changes and some differences in approach. Could you maybe summarize some of the key changes that have been taking place in terms of some of those energy organizations within the government? Hi, Santiago, you may have mute on. If you could just take off the mute.
Yeah,
there we
okay.
go.
Yeah. Well, I think that the main change is that is a little bit what I call back to the future, where all the organization is very centralized. This a good example is they used to have 3 undersecretaries and the energy secretary, and now it's only 1. And that was the scheme that was for several years. But that's when the CENER was basically a puppet, because the CFE president and the Pemex president really negotiated with the president of the country and not with the Secretary of Energy. So I think a little bit of that change. Also that unofficially Manuel Bartlett is the Undersecretary of Energy of Electricity, so he's handling CFE, but also he's deciding a lot of the policy or what is going to be moved in the electricity sector. And Rocío Nale, the Secretary of Energy, is more focused into oil and gas. So I think that will be the main changes. And, of course, the new 4 appointed commissioners at CRE, that we have to see if how they will perform, especially after very, I will say, unsatisfactory presence in the Senate when there were questions. So that will be my view at least in the short term.
Okay. And Marco, do you have anything to add to that, in particular with regards to some of the changes that have happened in Semarnat, the Environmental Commission?
Yes, Jamie, thank you. I think that is very relevant what Santiago is pointing, because at the end, you get a new ecosystem in the institutional arrangement. We just need to understand what is the real purpose in terms of the energy policy. In terms of the regulation, is quite similar if the role of the CRE, as we had in the prior regime, regulate one single monopolist rather than an open market. So I think that in terms of the regulation, it's very clear the role of the CRE. I don't see anything in terms for CRE to promote, for example, open market, but at the end, this is part of the transition, as Santiago is saying. But I think that the role of Semarnat in terms, Semarnat is the Minister of Environment in Mexico. I think that is very relevant and takes a very important role in terms of the mitigation, because at the end, due to the competitiveness that Pablo has mentioned, and due to the new role, more proactive role for Semarnat, I think that at least for small-scale projects, the role of Semarnat in terms of the mitigation is required to understand that the social policy for this government is also another important focus to address in the mid and short term. In that regard, what I'm seeing is that the role of Semarnat to regulate the small-scale projects could be very relevant, even if SENER is not addressing the perspective for energy policy in that point. Finally, I think that we need to follow up what are the new structuring for the projects for small and medium scale. Here in Mexico, we have essentially two regulation schemes, which are isolated supply below 0.5 megas, and of course distributed generation. I think that the role of Semarnat in that two small-scale project could be very relevant and very different rather than the prior regime.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'd now maybe like to move on to more renewable energy focused specific challenges, shall we say, that are facing Mexico's renewable energy sector. Earlier this year, there was the cancellation of some transmission tenders, and with an enormous capacity for annual growth in terms of the need for energy in Mexico, some people were left scratching their heads a little bit. But in terms of bringing online more renewable energy capacity in the future, there is a need for more transmission infrastructure development. I'd like to maybe ask Dino to begin with your perspective on where you see this additional capacity connecting to the grid with the recent cancellation of transmission tenders, and how you think the market might cope in the coming years.
Surely, at least in terms of renewable energy, the transmission cancellation tenders, has a twofold effect. First, any transmission additions that were going to come north to south, is going to have an uptick in terms of renewable energy development, simply because that, in large part, was also going to favor wheeling natural gas generated electricity from existing plants down into areas of demand that were in need of more energy. But now, without those additional capacities in terms of wheeling, you're going to need to see more localized renewable energy developed energy projects in areas where there's either a good wind resource, or anywhere in Mexico where there's an excellent solar resource. So at least in the interim, I think solar development is going to see a boom. In terms of additional capacity coming out of, say, like the Oaxaca area, which would have favored wind development, there I think is going to have a dampening effect in terms of additional development, because transmission has been the lifeblood of wind development in that area. One of the things that I think is going to be important for renewable energy developers going forward, just to touch on something that was just mentioned in terms of Semarnat and the government social policies, is regardless of where development is taking place, it's going to be extremely important for developers and investors to be very focused on the effects of their project on environmental and social issues. It's now risen, I think, to the very top of the consideration stack for the government. And I think it's going to be very important for developers to work with local communities, indigenous communities, and to see how their projects are affecting the surrounding areas. And, that goes for solar, for wind, hydro, geothermal, and it applied to the transmission development. So I think the project development for renewable energy is going to see a boost in the short term, simply because energy is needed. Solar energy is probably the easiest to bring up in the shortest amount of time, both in terms of studies and just it being able to be installed on a modular basis. So you can start small and simply oversize the interconnect or the substation, and then build on additional generation capacity as needed.
That's great. And Pablo, I'd like to ask if you like to add to that, but also just to get an understanding of what you see as some of the biggest challenges facing renewable energy development at the moment in Mexico.
So I think Dino brought a really good point. Like if before all the social and the social and environmental, particularly the social part, studies were vital, and a few years ago we saw sort of a big backlog of applications being under consideration. That's now it's going to go to the next level, and it's only fair, to be honest. So more scrutiny is never bad, particularly in this sort of situation. So it's an issue which, to some degree, will differentiate good developers from not so good developers, and maybe some sites that were borderline with respect to the impact that might have will have to be passed on or phased out. So interesting topic that again will bring more more scrutiny in the developer side and probably better quality overall. With respect to challenges, I do recall many years ago in a conference someone mentioned the fact that no wires, no wind, no solar, no anything. So transmission is going to be paramount. If it was before, and now it's going to be even of a greater challenge. And then moving forward, given the lack of auctions or mandates from the government in one way or another, it will require another level of sophistication with respect to private PPAs. We as an industry everywhere, we're moving toward that sort of corporate PPAs, private PPAs, bilateral, you can name it, hedge. In Mexico is going to be a playground for that. Proximity with the U.S. market, with all the talent and liquidity and capital, and B, a country where you have a real demand for electricity at a reasonable and flat price, and that's what solar and wind produces and provides. So what I see is over the next years a significant increase of bilateral contracts, and with everything that involves, meaning legal, structuring, finance. Is a new breed of expertise that is going to have to come to keep the industry rolling and moving.
Actually, yeah, I'm glad you brought up bilateral PPAs. Obviously, this is something on the end of everyone's tongue at the moment. In terms of, Mexico has 12,000 potential qualified users. So qualified user in Mexico is someone with a demand greater than 1 megawatt. Marco, obviously you advise on clients from small, medium, and also large enterprises. What kind of appetite are you seeing from these qualified users for securing their energy from renewable energy sources in Mexico? Obviously, we've had a number of large players like Grupo Bimbo, Walmart, Cemex already leading the way. But in terms of some of the companies you're speaking to, what are some of the perceptions that they have of renewable energy? Is it something they're looking at?
Yes, Jamie, I think that this is the most attractive business opportunity in this moment because due to the performance of the power rates, we have a very interesting incentive for those end users that are not required to directly participate in the wholesale market. Therefore, the only opportunity to move or migrate into the new market is to qualify. In my opinion, it's very understand what should be the role of the qualified users, and the main support to promote that business should be to maintain the dispatch and the optimization process in the wholesale power market that this remain as in the prior rate. That this is the point that we have a very interesting opportunity, not for the perhaps the 100 most important users in the country, but you can think the 101 to the 1,000 users that are big users also, but they don't have any interest and any capability to understand what is the real performance. That is for that reason that in my perspective, the role of the qualified user to support not only to provide energy, but also in terms to prepare a strategy according to the load profile, according to the possibility to make trading on behalf of those users is the most important opportunity here. It's more attractive. And if you also add the opportunity to physically supply the energy to a central power plant in terms of the isolated supply scheme is also relevant. In my perspective, there is a very interesting opportunity because at the end, due to the understanding in this moment of CFE in order to integrate again the generation side, it doesn't imply necessarily that you will get more efficient power plants from CFE side. And it implies that in terms of the dispatch, you will get a most interesting opportunity for those qualified users.
Okay, and I mean, what are some of the barriers to further adoption of renewables? I mean, a few that I've spoken to have mentioned a bit of uncertainty around PPAs. Are you hearing the same thing from your clients?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the big scale projects aligned to the next possible auctions to be announced in the future, I think that the general structure could be different because according to the last announcement from the head of the renewable unit in the Ministry of Energy, we understand that that announcement was trying to address in a more different way in terms of the not strictly speaking big scale project. They are trying to move into the social welfare aligning to that auction. And in my perspective, the result of that is that of course, we can get non only big scale projects. The impact on the prices perhaps could be the challenge because in my perspective, if you think as a whole energy policy, you cannot promote in the more efficient way if you are trying to promote small scale projects and medium sized projects. And it's for that reason that the most important challenge for those auctions in terms of the general scheme will be what will be the prices as a result of those auctions.
And I think pricing is also a really important issue. And Santiago, I'd love to get your input here. Obviously, last year there was quite a hike in the prices for a lot of these commercial, industrial off-takers and energy users in Mexico. What are you forecasting for this year, and what do you think the renewables are competitive enough to compete with the CFE?
Yeah, well, I think that as you mentioned, the hike on the prices was very steep, put everyone in to consider alternatives in order to buy from another source other than CFE. But I see that most of the market is very nervous on, they don't know if the electrical rates, where are they going to move. I think that these early morning talks of AMLO are not helping to move forward. Everyone is waiting to get some signals from the heaven in order to know where to move. My perspective is that they are not going to lower at all, because they need these resources, and it was also mentioned during the beginning of this administration that they will not rise the price of the energy. That of course has not been maintained as gasoline keeps on going up. So I don't think that is going to be the prices are going to be down. I think that the main challenge is to convince people to jump from CFE to other options. I think that a little bit of a Stockholm syndrome is in place. People they want a new service, but they are also afraid to make the next move in order to contemplate another supplier. But eventually, I think that it will start to happen as the waters settle, and I think that right now it's you can compete easily against the electrical rates. The only dark cloud that I see is how this perception that the transmission is not being paid, and obviously that will jump into distribution is not being paid because of this perception that they have, that they are subsidizing renewable energy through the rates of transmission. And as I mentioned, I think that it will jump into, the argument will jump into distribution very soon. That will be my comment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think aside from development of bilateral PPAs, another very interesting area which I hadn't really hear come up much in Mexico before the last, say, 6 to 8 months, is the merchant model. And this is where I would love the input from Dino and also from Pablo in terms of the merchant model. How feasible do you think that is in Mexico? And is it something that you are hearing from your customers and clients, Dino, in terms of looking at financing potentially or even developing?
Yeah, no. In terms of merchant power, I think that's a ways off, and in fact, even some of the more recently financed renewable energy projects that had the shorter, and by shorter, not the 25-year PPAs, but the 15-year PPAs, had produced a challenge for project finance lenders. So financing is always the Achilles heel for any project, and long-term project financing and its availability, it's what drives development. So even if you do find interested players in the Mexican energy market, long-term, unless they're willing to do a large part of the project on balance sheet, and with very low leverage, merchant projects, there doesn't really seem to be an appetite from the lending community to lend into those types of projects. One of the things that I think is important to think about too, in terms of pricing and the drive between just the merchant market and the long-term PPA market, is for commercial and industrial players. We had worked on some of the last Walmart renewable energy PPAs, and there was another one that I worked on for with Grupo Alfa as an off-taker. And shortly after that, the one thing that I saw in the market was a resistance from some of the commercial and corporate players seeing or doing power purchase arrangements, because they saw the price of renewable energy dropping auction after auction after auction, and there didn't seem to be a bottom. And now with the uptick in energy pricing, one of the things that I think you're going to start seeing is a move away from simply letting the market decide your cost input to having a fixed long-term energy price as a cost input for whatever you're manufacturing or assembling. So I think you're going to start seeing the move away from simply letting the market decide what the pricing is going to be and buying at whatever the market price is, to wanting to make sure that you have a hedge against energy pricing, and either look to doing a joint venture arrangement with a developer, so that way there's some insight as to what the cost looks like, the structure looks like, or simply buying the energy from a long-term developer with a number of protections built into the PPAs. But in terms of letting your cost simply float with the market rates, I don't see that as something that either the commercial or industrial sector is going to be willing to do, nor the financing sector willing to finance.
No, the few developers I've spoken to who are looking at the merchant model in Mexico, certainly they were doing it in combination with maybe a long-term PPA as well, and rather than just a pure play merchant model. And Pablo, in terms of your perspective here, have you ever dabbled in the merchant model? Is it something that that you think is feasible in the Mexican market?
Feasible. It really depends on your risk appetite. But if you think about it, I mean, merchant is often sort of the byproduct of well-established, well-known, well-regulated environments. And I would say that Mexico today is maybe not neither of those. So it's a hard sell unless you do have really, attractive capital behind that is willing to take that sort of risk. I would have a hard time right now thinking of anyone going merchant and expecting to have a relatively sensible, leverage on your debt or your financing. And it's always hard. I mean, doing merchant is hard to do in Texas or Spain or Germany. Think about doing it in Mexico, where we have relatively short track record of what the market and how efficient the market is. So maybe something for the future. It may be something for for the next round of projects. I would have a hard time to believe anyone going merchant right now.
Mm-hmm. And Marco, have you had any inquiries in that regard? Have you been advising anyone in particular with regards to the merchant model and whether it might make sense in Mexico?
Yeah, I think that is a new topic to be understood by all the participants. I think that in this moment, since we don't have any end user directly participating in the wholesale power market, we don't have the real perspective of the demand side, because we only have the representatives of load centers, which are the qualified users. And I think that performance in the spot prices are more related to the trading strategies from those traders and suppliers. But I think that according to the maturity in the spot markets understanding from the end users, I think that we can get a more interesting signal from those markets. It's important to understand that in this moment, we don't have implemented yet the hour ahead market. I think that according to the experience with other markets, that spot market is very relevant to understand what is the difference between the volatilities in the real time market and the day ahead. And this is part of the transition that I understand in the perspective of the SENACE's role as operator in that assignment for the demand side. But I think that in terms of the financing, we are seeing interesting lenders to put some perspectives and of course resources to understand not orally but at least in a very interesting part in the transaction. They are seeing the performance of those prices as a very interesting target to be addressed in the financing structure. And I think that is another important aspect, because if you have one single provider as CFE is trying to become again, we need to understand what are the other alternatives, perhaps at a big scale, but in medium size scale project, mainly for solar and perhaps for hydro, which is another important technology, we can get interesting opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And thank you very much, Marco. You touched on financing. Now, look, I want to get to distributed generation before we finish, but before we do, I think it's quite important to mention the activity that we're seeing on the M&A side in Mexico's renewable energy sector. Dino, perhaps you can give a bit of perspective there in terms of why we're seeing that kind of movement and why it's so active at this stage.
Yeah, no, in terms of M&A, I mean, I think that's the area to be in right now, simply because as a developer, you're able to get a jump on the development curve. And as I mentioned earlier, as the risk profile of the country shifts, you're going to have the more conservative developers exit the country while things settle down. You're going to have the more entrepreneurial developers come into the country, essentially get a second bite at the apple, to the extent that they were late to the big surge in renewable energy development within the country. And I think it's going to also provide, at least for the private equity players and some of the investment funds, an opportunity to buy up projects, perhaps at a discount. Again, as people are exiting, it just changes the dynamics in terms of the supply side and demand side of projects. In the past couple of years, there seemed to be a real big push for developers to come in and compete for larger and larger projects, simply because you had economies of scale with respect to some of the auctions. And now you have a number of those developments that are awaiting development, that are awaiting financing, and it's going to take fairly large players to get those across the finish line and bring them to market. So it's an exciting time for, I think, people wanting to get into an active market. The cautionary point that I would make is you need to know what you're getting yourself involved in. So you need to know the risk profile, not just of your project, but of the market in general. You need to look at history in terms of lessons learned. So issues around environmental permitting, FCPA, tax structuring, all that is going to be critical. So even if there are opportunities that look attractive on the surface, a number of these projects have history to them, and there are market players that understand that history, that understand some of the risks associated with any development. So it's going to be important that people surround themselves with the right advisors and the right structuring before entering the market.
Okay, and Pablo, obviously you're someone from the outside looking in. I mean, although you do know Mexico very well, in terms of the movement and action we're seeing on the M&A side in Mexico, is this something sort of Paratus has been looking at? You know, what kind of due diligence have you been doing in the market?
Sure. So I think everyone is looking at the opportunity. A good developer is like a firefighter, and you get in where there's a fire. Including now, there is opportunities. I think it's a good time. It's really good time if you're a developer to start looking at the Mexican market with a view of 2 to 3 years out, maybe more. And as technology evolves, there's good projects will have an edge and will be able to place energy. There is clear. I would echo Dino's comment that there is clear a number of opportunities, and there is clear a time for true developers with risk capital to start looking at assets for the future. I think if anything, the world is cautious and patient, and as long as your capital and your team fully understand that these are the two elements, basically to complete transaction, there is a significant opportunity right now. Mexico, nevertheless, is a third of the Latin American economy, so that's not a market that you want to neglect. And things change, and there's always issues here and there. And right now, we're probably sort of in the low, and that's the good time to look for assets.
That's great, thank you. And look, we obviously would have so much to talk about, and we've only got a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes left. But before we finish, I think it would be a travesty to neglect distributed generation. And here, I'd like to get your perspective, Santiago. And I'd just love to hear what you think, where you think the greatest opportunities are in Mexico's DG sector, and what's driving the development of the sector at the moment. Hi, Santiago, you may have your mute on again.
Yes, sorry, Amy. I think that in general, the market will have a lot of opportunities. It's I always been a contrarian in the markets. When things are very good, everyone is bullish about them and trying to invest, and that presents a number of challenges later when the market goes, the winds head more into the south. But my perspective is very optimistic. Of course, you have to cherry pick on opportunities here and there, and I also believe that due to the constraints in transmission and in some cases in distribution, depending on the area that you want to see, to have a good knowledge on where are the good nodes and the modeling into the future of the system will be a particularly important information to have.
Okay,
I think that will be ideal to have. Mm-hmm.
No worries, thank you, Santiago. And Marco, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Just to take care on the short-term noise, perhaps, if we go back some steps, we actually don't have even the national development plan. I think that in terms of the perspective for the energy policy in this moment, we really do not have any reference in terms of planning. And I think that the best strategy at this moment is to wait, to be careful with those news that are not strictly speaking objective, and we need to understand what are the real energy policy. Perhaps that energy policy doesn't come from the news and the public announcement, but I think that we need to adjust our matrix risk and adjust our networking approach in terms of what are the real information that we need to take.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Look, we're just about at the end. Unfortunately, we don't have any time to take questions today, so apologies to all of the listeners who sent some questions in. I'd just like to end with one final question to each of the panelists today, and it's just if you could perhaps summarize where you see Mexico's energy sector in 12 months in one or two sentences, how would you describe it? So let's say we're sitting here in April 2020, and we've had a whole year since this webinar. What do you think one of the biggest factors will have been that has developed in the renewable energy sector? I might start with you, Dino, if that's okay.
Surely, well, I'm always cautiously optimistic. I think the deciding factor is going to be the availability of financing. Of late, and as policies have changed, and even under the last administration, to a policy landscape that was ever evolving, you had some of the market leaders in financing, like the North American Development Bank and Bancomex, essentially leading the charge, and at times going where others kind of feared to tread. So I think lenders of that type, development banks, export banks, are going to be critical as the market continues to develop, and to the extent there's any uncertainty. If long-term or longer-term PPAs come back into the market, then I think you're going to start seeing a large number of the commercial lenders coming back into the market. So I think the lenders will decide the fate of the market.
Great. And it's Pablo.
Sure. I think in a year's time, we'll be talking about bilateral commercial corporate PPAs. I think there is so much energy and talent and appetite for the renewable energy that in a year's time, all the smart ecosystem will have figured out the way to sort of bypass all the uncertainties, and we'll be talking about sale of energy as we are seeing in many other markets. So if I have to predict something, not really good on that, but if I have to, I would say, look out for the commercial, the bilateral PPAs.
No problem. Thank you. And Marco, I'll move on to you now.
Yeah, just to follow up what will be the discussion on the budget for the next year. Is in terms of the federal administration, that discussion will start in September. And I think that this is the timing within the government to clearly understand what is the real impact in order to promote with the private sector jointly the generation side in this country, and of course the renewable will be competitive in that position.
Perfect. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Santiago, your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I think that in April 2020, we will look backwards and see that a lot of the worries that we have right now were not substantial, that we can always find new opportunities in the market and profit from the actual situation. I always point out that, all our parents, they prosper very much in this, what I call old Mexico, and this is a little bit of the administration now. So we just need to adapt and find the best way to do it. That will be my perspective.
That's great. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And look, before we close today's webinar, I just wanted to give you a very brief summary of what will be taking place at MIREC Week this year. Obviously, a lot of the issues that were covered today will be focused on during the event over 3 days later in May. And we have a whole host of speakers already confirmed, a great lineup from developers, corporate energy users and off-takers, banks and investors, government representatives, consultants, EPCs, and of course, representatives from the distributed generation sector. In terms of the content, we're going to be focusing on everything to do with clean energy. So AMLO's energy policies, hopefully we'll have a electricity framework by that stage. We'll be looking at financing and investment in renewable energy sector, the development of utility scale projects, but also operation and maintenance, distributed generation, corporate energy, and also the development of Mexico's grid, including the advent of energy storage. For all the details, just visit the website, mirecweek.com, and it will have everything ready for you there. Now, look, I wanted to thank all of today's panelists and also to all of you for tuning in today. We'll have a recording ready to rewatch or share shortly, and you'll receive an email with further details how you can rewatch the webinar online. So thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you to all of you from the MIREC Week team, and hopefully we'll see you next month in Mexico City. Thank you.